Hello. Hi, can I have everyone's attention? As it is after 1, we will begin. My name is Aaron Francis. I am the Research and Policy Officer here at FETS. As you are all hopefully aware, approximately 7% of undergraduates have requested that a referendum be held concerning the following question. Do you think the University of Waterloo should sever ties with the following institutions due to their complicity in violations of the human rights of Palestinians? University of Haifa, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Technion, Israeli University of Technology, Tel Aviv University, and the Weizmann Institute of Science. Today, members of the yes and no committees will argue in favor or against the question. The rules are as follows. Each committee will be given 3 minutes to make an opening statement. Each committee will be given up to 10 minutes to debate each of the following 3 points. They're up there as well. Maintaining or severing ties with the universities will benefit those living in the region of the universities. Maintaining or severing ties with the universities will benefit the undergraduate students of the University of Waterloo. Maintaining or severing ties with the universities will benefit Canadian society at large. Afterwards, each committee will be given 3 minutes to make closing remarks. I will issue a 30 seconds left warning when it is appropriate. All right, in order to decide order, we'll just flip a coin. I have a Canadian quarter here. Can I have someone call heads or tails? I'm going to let it drop. The call was heads. And it is heads. The no committee will go first, and then we'll alternate. And so, bear with me as I get my timer up and running. Begin.
Hello? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and I appreciate all your attendance here. As the chairman of the No Committee, I'd like to welcome your attendance and this discussion. The No Committee more or less stands for the right for academic freedom, and we also believe that politics should not enter the grounds of academia. There are two big things that are occurring right now that just happened recently, actually, was that Justin Trudeau was recently on campus, and he pledged $12 million to Southern Ontario Water Consortium. You can find in your local imprint paper. And one of the big things, and it's a quote from Mr. Trudeau, our Right Honourable PM, is that the commercialization of new technology in all areas of water and wastewater treatment and monitoring. It is also my understanding that the universities targeted today in this referendum are some of the best in that field, in the field of water research as well as wastewater treatment. It is also my understanding that we all use water. We are all human. We are made of, I believe, 73% water. I'm a science student at 4B, so I might be a little rusty on that, but that's my understanding of it. Water research benefits us all, right? Much like most of the research that comes out through these Israeli universities that we're targeting. And the No Committee believes that at the end of the day, why are we targeting universities that are benevolent? You know, the actions of a government, the actions of other institutions, maybe not so, but at the end of the day, the universities themselves are benevolent. They're helping us. And we at the No Committee would like to ask you guys to vote no in the upcoming vote, so that we maintain academic freedom and integrity, as well as keeping politics out of your universities. Thank you.
Begin.
Children marched in front of tanks used as human shields. White phosphorus shells lit ablaze, indiscriminately attacking children, attacking soldiers, attacking civilians without care. Homes bulldozed, remote controlled, taken over by Israeli forces, forced sterilizations of Ethiopian Jews. We're not here to talk about academic freedom, but we kind of are. We're here to talk about human rights violations and what we as a student body can accomplish through referendum. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for everyone who showed up. So today, I'm just going to be outlining the terms of the case, terms of this debate, and why they're important. So first off, you might have been misled the idea that an academic boycott boycotts all universities in Israel and that we are targeting all academia there. That's not true. We're only targeting 5, and we are only targeting the 5 that are explicitly complicit with the IDF, explicitly complicit in the occupation of Gaza. That's what we're talking about. They tell you that we're not going to be able to collaborate. That's not true. We're just going to put bars in place so that you can't use Israeli-only funding for your research. If you can get a grant through another means, you can collaborate that way too. Finally, we're going to be talking about the goals of BDS, and why specifically we want to issue this referendum. The first is that we need to end the occupation on Gaza. It's one of the most horrific things happening in the world right now. 2,000 people died in the summer of 2014. We don't want that to happen today. This is a non-violent solution to that. Secondly, we need Israel to identify and respect Palestinian rights, to not treat them as second-class citizens, to treat them as people equal to those that are Jewish. We think that's reasonable for everyone in the world to expect of them. And finally, for them to respect the right of return of Palestinian refugees, to allow them to come home, whether that's from Israel, whether that's from within Palestine in occupied portions of Palestine, or whether that's Lebanese Palestinians wishing to go home being blocked by IDF. Thank you.
All right, we'll move on to the debate points concerning 2A. So maintaining or severing ties with the universities will benefit those living in the region of the universities. Each committee will have up to 10 minutes for this point. Beg your pardon? Right, so we're alternating now, so the no committee will be going now. All right, and begin.
Right, so to begin with, the question posed before us is, how would maintaining ties with these universities benefit those living in the region? So let's be very clear. The referendum says that we're going to sever ties. We're not going to put bars in place. We're not going to just mitigate some of the cooperation we have. We are going to sever ties. Severing ties means all ties. So let's talk about these ties that we have with the Israeli universities. First of all, there's a program called Valley of Peace currently happening in Israel. It's a program funded together by the Palestinians, the Israelis, and those living in Jordan. It's a program supported by the Israeli universities, as well as our universities here and across the world. The program is a joint proposal to build a canal that would connect the Red Sea and the Dead Sea. It's going to yield profit, produce hydroelectric power, lead to jobs, and potentially unprecedented economic cooperation between the peoples of all three lands. Waterloo supports that. The Palestinians support that, and the Israelis support that. Sever ties would have us cut out the cooperation with those programs. They would have us cut out the water research we do together with the Israeli universities. That's unacceptable. Then there's the program called MEET, Middle East Education Through Technology. It's an innovative educational initiative aimed at creating a common professional language between Palestinian and Israeli youth. Working together with MIT and universities like Waterloo, MEET enables participants to acquire advanced technological and entrepreneurial skills that they can take back and drive social advance in their communities. In their first year, students get to learn Java. In their second year, students get to learn entrepreneurial skills while also discussing advanced topics in computer science. Sounds a lot like our own programs here at Waterloo. These programs take the top Palestinian and Israeli students from high schools, bring them together, and build a community, and then send them back home to develop businesses as their final long-term project to benefit their own communities. Severing ties would mean we don't support that anymore. It would mean we don't want this kind of economic and educational cooperation between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That's unacceptable. But let's continue to talk about the projects that particularly the universities do together with Waterloo. So Technion and Waterloo are together developing quantum computing. Aside from that, in terms of more practical and applied technologies, they're developing lab on a chip. I don't know if you guys have heard of that, but it's a tool used for medical diagnosis that's going to revolutionize the industry, not only for the people in Israel and in Palestine, but all across the world, by making it much simpler to diagnose medical conditions and much cheaper. Clearly, it'll be a great contribution to the people there and the people all across the world. Severing ties would mean we end that research. That research would no longer go on. That's unacceptable. Aside from that, Technion and Waterloo together are working on water contamination reversal. Water is one of the biggest issues in the Middle East today. There is a shortage of fresh water. There is a deficit. It affects not only the communities, not only the economic welfare of the people, but particularly the lives of Palestinians and Israelis. If we cut this water research we do of the universities, we will be harming everyone who lives in the region, because we'll be taking away what they need most for life, fresh water. That is unacceptable. But let's go on. The Weizmann Institute has a program with Waterloo's nanotechnology engineering program. They hire interns from us, and we're going to hire interns from there. Clearly, everyone wants to have an internship experience. Everyone wants to be able to do co-op. We want to share what we have here. So maintaining ties is going to make that possible. It's going to make it possible for Israeli and Palestinian students to have the co-op opportunities that we have as well. Cutting that off would be unacceptable. When you're discussing the benefits of maintaining ties, you also have to discuss the harm of severing ties. So let's go into that. When you propose to sever ties, then you're proposing that we endorse segregation, oppression, the singling out of these universities as being responsible for the horrible two-sided conflict going on in the Middle East. You generate antipathy. There will be no benefit of this referendum to the Palestinian people or to the Israeli people living in the affected regions. There will be no benefit. The only end result of severing ties will be to create a further rift between the two nations. We don't want a further rift. We want cooperation. That is what everyone wants. Haifa, the University of Haifa, has a world-renowned peace studies program. The University of Tel Aviv has an international program in conflict resolution and mediation. By severing ties, you're saying no to those programs. You're saying no to the very programs that are actively working on trying to build bridges and solve this conflict. That is unacceptable. And finally, let's talk about Technion as well. Just this March, a few months back, Palestinian graduate students of Technion had the opportunity to meet President Barack Obama. Now, there's no secret around the impressive science and technology arising from Technion. Ingenuity resulting in 3 Nobel Prizes and life-saving innovations such as the ReWalk. It enables paraplegics to walk, climb stairs, and even drive. Or the revolutionary drug Azilect that has brought relief to millions of sufferers of Parkinson's disease. But the Palestinian students who met Barack Obama got to tell a different story. It was one of educational cooperation and openness between two people the world has deemed at war. A story of the opportunities of peace and the power of educated humanism. By proposing that we sever ties and close these connections with Technion, you're saying no to that. You're saying that you don't want cooperation between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And that is unacceptable. There will be no benefit of severing ties, but there will be benefits of maintaining ties. In fact, let's talk about positive alternatives to the normalization of segregation, violence, and racism. Let's talk about programs like Heartbeat. Heartbeat is a musical program. It unites Israeli and Palestinian youth musicians to build critical understanding, develop creative, nonviolent tools for social change, and amplify their voices to influence the world around them. I urge you to go to their website if you have your phones, heartbeat.fm. Let's talk about artists for Israel. They utilize the power of art to beautify the land, uplift the people, enhance the reputation of all parties through creative humanitarian projects. These are the kind of ties that we want. We want to endorse these programs. We want these programs to be stronger, because the only way that things are going to get better is through cooperation in the region. By cutting ties, we cut that cooperation, and we're only worsening the conflict. So I urge you all to vote no. Thank you.
Begin.
Vote No would like to tell you that the only way in which we get a better world, in which Israel and Palestine aren't fighting, where there isn't a war, is through collaboration. What we're going to tell you on the Vote Yes side is that will never happen under the status quo and will never happen if you vote no. So what I'm going to be talking about is three things. First off, I'm going to be talking about the power struggle, how it came about. Wow, that's loud. How it came about, the history of those nations, specifically how the U.S. is involved and why we don't think peace treaties or peace talks are ever going to be impactful in that area. Secondly, we're going to be talking about nonviolence, what specifically it means, redefining the terms for you, because there's been a lot of misconception about this in the debate. And finally, I'm going to be talking to you about the principles of academic freedom and how we actually strengthen that if you vote yes. So, and after that, I'm just going to go through point by point what we kind of heard from Vote No and tell you why I don't think it's necessarily true. So, first off, about the power struggle. I have two ideas here. The first is how we're letting Palestinians define terms of their own resistance and why that's important. But secondly, I'm going to be talking to you about the specific case in which peace talks are happening, specifically between Israel and Palestine, and how we don't ever think that's ever going to work. So first off, Palestinians defining their terms of resistance. Recognize that the narrative of the Israel-Palestine conflict typically happens through the gaze or is written through the gaze of Israelis. It is written through the gaze of Israelis. Why? Because they have more money, because they have more influence, because their news, their information is disseminated through American news sources, because they simply just have a stronger foothold in the global mindset and in the global ethos. What we tell you is that, yes, it is a two-sided conflict. We absolutely agree, but only one side is ever visible. So what happens when we change the narrative? What happens when we ask the Palestinians, 176 of their civil liberties societies, what we ask them and tell them, what do you want us, the global community, to do? They cite South Africa, they cite Desmond Tutu, they cite Nelson Mandela, they tell us about the apartheid there, they tell us that the same thing that happened there is exactly what they're calling for now, something that won't kill anyone, something in which soldiers don't have to fight. Simply a boycott, simply divestment, simply sanctions. We think that that's how we let Palestinians define the terms of their own resistance amidst a sea of Israeli media. Secondly, let's talk about peace talks. Why specifically we don't think that Israel and Palestine are in a fair space, right? Recognize that every single peace talk, whether it's in the 1980s that we're talking about or as early as 2014, has happened on U.S. soil primarily. Why is that unfair, and why do we think that delegitimizes Palestine's claims? Recognize that Israel will unilaterally support recognize that the U.S. will unilaterally support Israel in most anything they do. We've seen this in the UN, we've seen this in numerous world organizations, we've seen this in the peace talks. When they sit at an American table, sitting on American chairs, sitting on American soil, and the only two people in that room are you, an Israeli, and an American, and you as a Palestinian think you're going to have a voice. We tell you that that's not likely. We tell you there's no onus or no burden for Israel to actually do anything. We think that there has never been a burden for Israel to do anything because of their unilateral support. We don't think peace talks will work in our world today, that there has to be something else. We've seen what happened in South African apartheid. We think it'll work here. Secondly, let's talk about methods of nonviolence, why we think that this is the best possible solution and why we think that this is the only solution. And because I've already told you why peace talks are a solution that absolutely won't work. Recognize that there are people dying, right? That currently in the status quo, the way in which we're trying to solve this conflict is letting them go to war. We're letting radical groups take power. We're letting hundreds of people die every year. In 2014, 2,000 people died. The year before, 700 in a single summer. What we tell you is that this is nonviolence because there are no guns involved. There's no shelling, there's no mortars, there's no bombs. What we tell you is that this is nonviolent, and that's what we have to solve. Because so many Gazans, so many Palestinians are telling us that they want this conflict to end, but they don't want it with more conflict. They don't want it with more violence. They need to find something else. Most have seen their families die around them. We're not okay with them seeing any more. We think that insofar that that this conflict will only worsen if we don't do something now, we're not going to support that. Finally, let's talk about academic freedom and why specifically we don't think marginalized groups in Israel have the same level of academic freedom that we would assert we have here in Canada. Recognize that we as students have the ability to just come to class and learn things, and the profs can be crazy, and that's all right, because you're there to learn crazy things. You're there to learn about weird points of view that you will have never learned otherwise. That's why we're here in university. That's what it's for. Recognize that doesn't exist in Israel. Recognize that if you're a Palestinian attempting to go to school, that the IDF might block you, or might strategically put military checkpoints in your way to prove your citizenship, to prove who you are. They might even put 2 or 3 or 7 on your way there. Or they might close the gates to your school like they did and not let you go despite your ability to perhaps or should be able to go. We think that that's unfair, that it doesn't allow Palestinians to educate themselves or educate themselves about a narrative that they themselves care about. But secondly, recognize that this also silences pro-Palestinians within Israeli universities. Recognize that there are certain laws in Israel that don't allow you to teach what you want. That if you have a pro-Palestine stance, you are not going to be able to teach at a local university, whether that's the 5 we're talking about now or any of the others in Israel. What happens when a generation of Israeli students grow up only hearing one side of a conflict? They become biased, and that conflict continues the next generation. We tell you that there are many, many, many laws, many violations of human rights that we have to overcome. And we as students have the power to voice our opinions now. Take that out of the hands of our administration, who have made that choice for us by partnering with schools like Technion, who have developed military weapons that have been used in the occupation in Gaza, to take that power back and say, no, we don't support this. Okay, so let's do some refutation. Quickly show you the flaws we think exist in the Vote No campaign. So first off, recognize that we're not actually severing ties with absolutely everyone. That's an oversimplification of what we're asking for on Vote Yes. We're asking that people like Sika don't actively look for jobs in Israel and just put their resources into other nations that aren't committing heinous violations of human rights, right? That's the approach we're taking. Those jobs don't magically disappear. If you really, really want to go to Israel, you absolutely can. If you want to travel to Israel, you absolutely can. But by the way, if you're Palestinian, you probably won't be allowed to do so. And we think that that's incredibly racist and problematic. Secondly, recognize that the collaborations that are going on now will likely still continue. We're fine with that. We just want all of the future collaborations until the human rights violations stop to just stop, right? We just don't want future collaborations in the process. We think that that's a reasonable stance to take. For them to corner us and say that we're severing all ties with these universities is ridiculous. We don't buy that. We don't think that's real. Okay, next, they agree with us, right? They implicitly agree with us that there are things that are happening in Israel that they won't tell you about. They don't mention any of these human rights violations. They don't mention the crimes against humanity or the people that die. They simply say that there's a conflict there. There are two sides. And yet they never weave for you the story of both sides. They never tell you why those two sides matter. What we tell you on our side of the house, not only are there examples of Technion doing atrocious things, like developing remote-controlled bulldozers that, by the way, destroy homes with people still inside them, right? Doing things like that are used by the IDF to kill Gazans, to kill parts that are illegally occupied. But what we tell you is that this resolution isn't actually something that they've presented in the best light or in the true light. We're not asking for a severing of all ties. We're asking for a severing of future ties, the ones we care about, and specific universities, the specific universities that are complicit in these human rights violations. vote yes.
On to point B. Maintaining or severing ties with the universities will benefit the undergraduate students of the University of Waterloo. Again, each committee will have up to 10 minutes. Begin.
Firstly, I'd like to say that the question in itself trivializes the harm that campaigns like this have on university students. Of course, in the short run, the everyday undergraduate student may not notice much difference in their university learning. The same would be true if University of Waterloo decided to cut academic ties with Harvard, Cambridge, or any other university. The yes side is in effect asking you to buy into the argument of no harm, no foul, that undergraduate students would hardly notice the change in their daily lives at our university. That would be no big deal and would not affect the quality of their learning experience. However, this question is an arbitrary and capricious question that needs to be reframed into the following. How could severing ties with these universities not help but be detrimental for undergraduate students at the University of Waterloo? In other words, the repercussions would be serious and permanent. I will now outline some short-term effects that will affect the undergraduate learning experience. Firstly, there would be no exposure of UW students to world-class professors from Israel who come to teach either permanently or on sabbatical at UW, especially in the science, engineering, computer, and mathematics faculties, which are the core of UW's global reputation. And vice versa for UW professors who would go to teach in Israel either on a temporary or permanent basis. Secondly, there would be reduced or no opportunity for co-op students exchanges between UW and Israeli universities, to the detriment of the students who would otherwise benefit from these potentially life-changing opportunities to study and experience life in a different cultural milieu. Thirdly, severing ties would also by and large eliminate the free flow of ideas, research, innovation, and cooperation between UW faculty, staff, students, and their Israeli counterparts to the detriment of everyone. This free flow of ideas globally is at the heart of academic freedom, and their truncation will hurt students' learning outcomes. Lastly, for those UW students of Jewish origin, either from Israel or anywhere in the world, there would most definitely be a feeling of persona non grata, person not welcome on our campus, especially if they were to voice their pro-Israel views publicly. In addition to the short-term effects, I will now outline some long-term effects that will affect the undergraduate learning experience. Firstly, a boycott of Israeli universities would be an example of discrimination based on national origin that would be harmful to the entire student body. UW is a diverse ethnic community with students of all backgrounds coming to learn at an academic institution that respects all dissenting views and encourages vigorous debate on a wide variety of topics. It is the essence of a student's university experience, really. To limit this debate by limiting exposure to students of a certain race, creed, color, or religion will erode the underpinnings of academic freedom, which is a hallmark of the university experience. Secondly, this boycott would become the thin edge of the wedge that could lead to similar campaigns against other undergraduate ethnic groups who come from countries that have questionable human rights records. Where would it all end? And how toxic would it make relations between different ethnic groups on campus on a daily basis? Lastly, the boycott being proposed is so un-Canadian and completely goes against Canadian values. We are a country that prides itself in its diversity and inclusion of all ethnic backgrounds. It's what makes people around the world love Canada and what they see when they visit. They're incredulous at how people who originated from almost every country on the globe get along and absorb a common set of values based on a decency and respect for one's fellow man and woman. We have never had a caste system like they had in India. No class system like what existed in England. No discrimination against women that occurs in many parts of the world. And I could go on and on. Do you want this kind of exclusionary behavior to creep into a Canadian academic system? I'll simply answer it. No, we do not. It would be an affront to multiculturalism that is at the heart of the Canadian experience. This divisiveness that occurs in other countries has no place in Canada or its institutions of higher learning. Thank you. Hello?
You may begin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, No Committee. Before we address the question of how will this referendum benefit the University of Waterloo undergraduate students, we first have to recognize who are we? Who are the undergraduates? We are a part of one of the most prominent global institutions in the world. We are leaders in innovation and are excelling in technological advancements. We take pride in our interdisciplinary learning and allowing the students to be masters of their own education. We are expected to represent this university when we leave this campus, whether it be co-op placements, whether it be on exchange trips, or whether it be as an alumnus. We are brand ambassadors for this university because we are shining embodies of its very core values. Those same values that are demanded of us are to be expected out of our university as well. What we are here to do as the undergraduates are to simply be complicit in change. We want to push and strive for ethical collaboration at the institutional level. So how will this referendum benefit the University of Waterloo students? The University of Waterloo has already taken a stance without our permission, and this is just an opportunity to give the voice back to us, the students. So 3 main benefits that I'll be outlining for you guys today is that we are brand carriers, the integrity and the academic freedom that happens at the institutional level, and that we should be having this political discussion. We should be capable of having this. So my first argument of brands. As representatives of the University of Waterloo student, that means something. When we go out there, we have University of Waterloo in our emails, we have it on our resumes, it's part of our transcripts. It's an embodiment of who we are. We are representative of that university. It's part of our core identity that we've graduated from here, that we come here. And that same representation that we give to University of Waterloo, they give to us as well. It's by association that we have this representation. And as academics, we want the institution to uphold those same values that they're expecting out of us. These are not our own demands. These are not our own policies. This is stuff that the university has outlined in their mission statement. It's not something that we're making up on the spot. We're simply reiterating back to the University of Waterloo what they've said to us. What we want to say as undergraduates is that we don't support these violations. Now, what these universities are committing are human rights violations. That's what we're calling them. And as a student, as a person, I'm not wanting to be associated with a crime. I don't want to be in support of a human rights violation. And I'm assuming many of you out here are going to be in agreement with that. You don't want to be complicit in human rights violations. You don't want to be associated with crimes. What's happening here is that the University of Waterloo is being associated with these universities. And by extension, we are also an association of those crimes. That's as simple as that. What we want to say is that as part of a global community, which the University of Waterloo states that we are, we want to be partners without these violations. We want to uphold the university to its own standards that it's implying out of us. We want to be partners, but without these human rights violations. Our current UW president, Ferdinand, has stated himself that the University of Waterloo shares values with these institutions, mainly Technion. But what's happening at Technion? Technion is conducting close research with the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Ministry Forces, as my partner has stated, they've been working in close connection with bulldozers that have actively been bulldozing occupied land, homes, with people still inside them. This is a known fact. Is that what we're saying the University of Waterloo values are? It's not. We're not complicit in this. We don't want to be associated with this. We want to show the university that this is not something that we stand for, and it's not part of one of our core beliefs. Moving on to my second point about integrity and academic freedom. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about what academic freedom means, what is integrity. I'd like to pull out the textbook definition of this. Freedom is an absolute concept. You can't have one or the other. And what we're seeing here is exactly a violation of that. We have peers here who would like to go on these exchange trips, who would like to be a part of this global collaboration. Problem is, we can't. Some of you here are not allowed to do this. Now, how is that possible? The university itself claims this. If you try to go onto their website and try to apply for a visa application, you'll see that it'll ask you to make sure that based on your background, you'll be granted a visa. What we're saying is, yeah, we're allowing this collaboration. We want you guys to go abroad. We want you guys to be there for co-ops and interns, but only some of you get to go, not all of you. Based on your ethnicity, your background, your cultural identity, you can't go abroad. And we're basically saying that, yes, we have these opportunities for some of you. Yes, we have these opportunities, but only some of your friends can go. Look around you. How many of you are part of an ethnic minority, of a religious minority? How many of you might not be granted this application? We've had our own students, our own peers, your friends maybe, who've tried to go through this application, who've wanted to expand their horizons, but unfortunately have been stopped even before getting there. They've not had this opportunity, and this is a violation of academic freedom happening on home. You don't need to go abroad for this. You don't need to catch a plane ticket across the Atlantic. This is happening at home. It's happening here. What we want to say is that this is not the definition of freedom as stated by the dictionary. You can check your textbooks. What we want to do is refine the structure. This structure is in place because this is how it's supposed to work. They want these discriminatory laws to be there. And we want to say is that we don't want to be facilitators of this racism. We are not complicit in this. Thank you. What we, the undergraduates at the University of Waterloo, want to do is reframe this structure so that it doesn't work like this. We want to give everyone equal opportunity, which is the definition of freedom. Now, another issue that the No Committee has brought up is that this is not something that we should be discussing. We're academics. This isn't something that we should be discussing. It's too complex of an issue. What we want to say is, are you kidding me? This is exactly what we should be talking about. Who are we? As I stated before, we're global learners. We're critical thinkers. This is expected out of us as a student at this university. You are demanded out of your profs, out of this university, to uphold that value, to go out into this world and be a critical learner, to be a global citizen. Are you saying that we can't have this complex discussion on campus? Are you saying that we can't have a civil discourse on campus? We're more than capable of having this conversation. In fact, we should be having this conversation. This affects all of us in every facet of our education and every facet of our lives. The conversation doesn't end when we leave here. It continues. We want to be making sure that our peers are knowledgeable about this issue, that they're leaving this area with a whole range of ideas. What we want to say is that the University of Waterloo is demanding something out of us, and we don't want to be complicit in these values that don't inherently we identify with. What we want to make sure is that these so-called 4,000 idiots who have called for this debate want more than just a sideline. We want change. We want it now, and we want it for everyone. So what I've outlined for you here is that we are carriers of this brand that the University of Waterloo has set for us. We are representing their own values back to them. We're saying, hey, if we're representing you, you got to do the same for us. My second point is academic freedom, infringement, and violation is already happening here on campus. You don't need to go anywhere to see this. We're just turning a blind eye to it. Just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. And that we need to be having this discussion. We're adults here. We're all capable of having this discourse. We're critical learners. We should be having this discussion. Thank you, and I yield my time to my partner.
Hi. Thanks, Mishkat. So what I'm going to be doing, yes, clap for my partner. Yeah. So I have a minute and a half left. What I'm going to be doing is I'm just going to be debunking the information that came out of their second speech. So first off, they told us about student empowerment, about student achievement, and about student opportunity. We actually issued a Freedom of Information request to the school to get the actual numbers of the kinds of opportunities that you guys have. There's been 37 co-op positions in the last 5 years. That's not many given the fact that half of the school is on co-op. There's been one faculty member that's gone to one of these 5 universities in the past 5 years. That's not very many opportunities. That's not much stifling. We don't know what information they're talking about, but maybe they got their information somewhere else. Secondly, they talked about the free flow and innovation. What we don't understand, though, is why they would deny that from the people in Palestine, why we're not allowing that same rhetoric for a pro-Palestinian stance in Israel, why we're not defending those points of views when we say that you can have those discussions there too, and we can have them here in Canada. Thank you very much. What we tell you on our side of the House is that we need academic freedom, not just here, not just in Canada, where we are already granted rights, where people respect us just for being people, but also in Israel as well. We don't think we get academic freedom when we tell them that the laws that are in place to stifle things like academic freedom and freedom of speech in Israel are okay. Thank you.
On to the third point. Maintaining or severing ties with the universities will benefit Canadian society at large.
Now, I understand you're all students at University of Waterloo, or most of you are, and this applies to both sides, actually. The reason why most of us came here was because of academic excellence, right? We are considered the MIT of the North, as it were. And, well, it's one of the reasons I came here, right, is the idea that we work with the best and brightest. We are the center of innovation for Canada. We are the center of progress in, STEM fields as well as other fields, right? And, that's, at the end of the day, that's why we're all here, regardless if you're a no or yes, right? That's one of the reasons you're here. And with that, because we're the best and brightest, we work with the best and brightest. We work with Moscow University, for example, which produces some of the best mathematicians and engineers in this world. And while the foreign policy of Russia, for example, is against Canadian foreign policy, and we've spoken on it before, that's not Moscow U's fault. And we don't front them on that. We allow them to work with us, right? And similar, the University of Beijing, right? Some of the best and brightest come out of there, and we still work with them despite China's competing interests with us on the global affairs field. So at the end of the day, University of Waterloo, we should work with the best and brightest because we are the MIT of the North, and we, the progression, the innovation that comes out of us working with these people helps Canadians. An example of this is us working with one of the universities targeted here, I believe it was Haifa, with the water drip irrigation system that we use in Saskatchewan, we use in the prairies, right, our breadbasket. And if you look at it right now, if you look at oil prices, right, they're falling, they're massive, it's terrible, right? So we need to diversify. Those water drip irrigation systems created in Israel with the use of, the University of Waterloo, some of our best and brightest, once again, some of you folk perhaps, is helping provide us diversity, economic diversity, which helps us all, right? It helps us in California, it helps feed people, and like I said, feeding people is a good thing. I myself, for example, I work in a botany lab, actually the greenhouse, which most of you may or may not know, it's just next to the DP library, and I'm helping produce a potato. Now, my family's Irish, and I'm sure some of you folks know about the Irish potato family, right? And the reason why I'm working with the potato means a lot to me, right? Because the idea of feeding people, of feeding, my ancestors, so to speak, is a big thing. And the reason why I'm working on it is to help, feed people, right? To increase the yield, the crop yields for potatoes. Now, Canada, for example, we've engaged in several conflicts, right? And as war is war, I'm sure some of them can be considered, violations of human rights, depending on the battle or whatever, whatever you wish to target. Would I like to be sanctioned, though, because the University of Waterloo perhaps provided something or, did something for whatever reason and is now part of a boycott? Should I be sanctioned? Because I'm benevolent at the end of the day. Right, I'm creating a potato, and I'm sure 99.9% of you, everyone in this crowd who works in research, who does things, is benevolent. You have a goal in mind to help humanity, right? And I believe that applies to all academics at the end of the day. The researchers at Moscow U, the physicians at Beijing U, their goal isn't to stifle Canadian foreign policy, to fight us and to cause problems and cause human rights. No, their goal is to progress, right? And progression helps everyone. It doesn't just help Canadian society at large, as the question dictates. It helps humanity, regardless of religion, regardless of, whatever devotion you call yourself, regardless of race or gender. We're all helped. My potato helps everyone, all right? The help of bionic arms helps everyone. University of Haifa has produced a compound that detects rohypnol in drinks. Rohypnol is also known as roofies. Now, my understanding is the detection of rohypnol is a good thing, right? At the end of the day, it helps everybody. right? Because it's a terrible drug that's used in terrible cases, and being able to detect it in your drink is amazing. Congratulations. Furthering that, two Israeli scientists at Hebrew University, one of the universities targeted here today, are producing an AIDS antiviral that will soon be starting clinical trials, which could help over 75,000 Canadians who are affected with HIV. Those are good things, right? And by cutting ties with these universities, by limiting our exposure and limiting our best and brightest from working with them, Israel has one of the largest and most vibrant startup communities, and we have velocity. We are amazing. This is something that we do as students. This is our pride. By limiting our connectivity with them, we could be halting research back by 5 to 10 or more years. Now, for example, let's say our researchers and their researchers partnered up and we developed a cure for cancer. But by doing this, by passing this, by voting yes and having this go through and us cut ties with them, and some key researchers are unable to attend and to work alongside Israeli scientists, and this research is pushed back 5, 10 years, and there is no cure for cancer for those 5, 10 years, people will die. At the end of the day, the universities themselves are not complicit with foreign policies, and the referendum is about human rights and academic institutions. Last time I checked, the University of Waterloo does not decide Canada's foreign involvement. Neither do these universities. And people have argued, well, what about conscription? Well, Germany conscripted to 2008, so do we stop working with Berlin U? Do we stop working with Russia? Russia still does conscription. What about China? At the end of the day, we, in Canada, this is how it works, we're bound by English common law, which is setting of precedents. And by setting this precedent, we can cut ties with so many universities, including, for example, we can cut ties with American universities. Most of our research comes from America. Are we going to academically isolate ourselves? Do we go from the MIT of the North to some backwater? No. That's not what happens. That's why I want you to vote no. Because you're helping Canadian society at large by allowing for people to continue their research that helps everybody. Canadians, Israelis, Palestinians, humanity. Thank you.
And you may begin.
Thank you. Now, we at the Yes Committee so far, my partners have argued that not only will voting yes be good for the people in the region, and that includes Israelis and Palestinians, but it'll also be great at giving the students of University of Waterloo a voice. Today, I'd like to add to that to say that voting yes, if this referendum passes, and especially if the BDS movement, Boycott, Divestment and Sanction movement, picks up more steam in Canada as it has in Britain, this will be good for Canada in general. I have 4 main points to support this, and that is that we as the students want to tell the Canadian government that students matter. We want to tell them to act at the will of the people. We also want to reinstate Canada's reputation as an independent country that values justice and peace. Thirdly, we want to show Palestinian Canadian refugees that their government stands with them, that we acknowledge the reason why they became refugees in the first place. And fourthly, I'd like to say that we want to demonstrate to Indigenous Canadians that we are serious about reconciliation because we value the rights of Indigenous people everywhere. So let's start with my first point, which is that we want to tell the Canadian government to act according to the will of the people. Our country's leaders, including Justin Trudeau, has said that there is a long-term path for Israel to respect the rights of Palestinian people. So far, we haven't seen any action on that. There hasn't been any reason for the leaders of our country to act in what human rights organizations and even Jewish organizations within Canada, such as Hashomer Hatzair, which I'm a part of, Jewish Voice for Peace, J-Space, and Habanim Dror, they've all talked about how we need to respect the rights of Palestinians, even though our country's leaders haven't acted on it. But we at the Yes Committee say that when students talk, when students send a message, our politicians will listen. Just yesterday,
Justin Trudeau bragged about UW at the World Economic Forum about, as the No Committee pointed out, how we are one of the best tech schools in the world. We don't think that's enough. We think that we should not only be one of the best tech schools in the world, but one of the best and most ethical tech schools in the world. In the future, it's not going to matter if we come out with the greatest technologies. It's going to matter what happens, what those technologies and what our collaborators are doing, and what these technologies are for, and what our collaborators are doing with their technologies. We believe that voting yes will send a strong message to the government of Canada that UW is about ethical tech, and that Canada should act according to the will of the people, especially the students. Now, I believe that, in Canada we've had a rocky history, but we've also had a number of instances where Canada has stood up for peace and justice. This includes Lester B. Pearson's peacekeeping efforts in the Suez Crisis and our stance against apartheid South Africa. Now, as we know, and we know from the election, it was an election issue, that Canada is losing its reputation as a peacekeeping nation, as a country that values justice. In UN votes, we'll often, when it's a question of recognizing Palestine or recognizing the human rights violations of Israel, we'll vote with the United States and Israel and very few other countries instead of the almost completely, instead of the international community, which almost completely agrees and sides with the human rights of Palestinians. Now, we want to reinstate this reputation of Canada being a nation that values peace and justice. And that means we need to show that as students, as educated people, we believe in human rights. We want this ball to get rolling across Canadian universities, which it already has, and tell the government that our voices matter. We want to be a country that values peace and justice. And if you believe in that too, we hope you vote yes. Now, we believe that we in the Yes Committee don't just believe that if this referendum passes, it'll be good as Canada's stance in the global community, but it'll be good for people in Canada right now, and that includes Palestinian Canadian refugees. As it stands, our government says that they value equal rights for all people and Indigenous rights. Indeed, Justin Trudeau said that he's going to respect the principles of the UN Declaration on Indigenous rights. But how would it feel if you are a Palestinian refugee coming into Canada and you find that your government, or maybe the university that you go to, collaborates with universities that build the equipment that made you into a refugee in the first place? This is absolutely absurd. If we Canadians are serious about being a welcoming place for refugees, which I believe we're taking steps to, then we need to acknowledge the reasons why Palestinian refugees became refugees in the first place, and take steps to make it so that this will never happen again. That means instituting the right of return for all Palestinians. And that is a goal. And one of the ends of the BDS movement, which voting yes and this referendum passing would be a historic step in that happening. Now, finally, it's not just new Canadians and Palestinian refugees into Canada who would benefit and who would feel more welcome in Canada if this referendum passes, but also the Indigenous people of Canada. Now, we all recognize that Canada has its own brutal history of colonialism and marginalizing Indigenous people. But I'm thrilled that Canada and the Canadian government is finally taking steps to improve our relations with Indigenous people. And that includes the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That means just acknowledging that residential schools were a thing. We're starting to take steps to improve our relations with our Indigenous population. However,
These statements, many of which have come from Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, these statements about how we recognize the rights of Indigenous people come off as hollow, like we're not serious about these statements unless we defend the rights of Indigenous people everywhere, and that includes the Indigenous people of Palestine. We believe we believe that if this referendum passes and more students and it picks up even more steam across Canada, which it already has to some extent, that this would send a strong message to Indigenous people everywhere that we stand with you. It's no surprise that out of all the student groups who stood up in support of this referendum, possibly the group that was the loudest and stood up with the most support was the Aboriginal Students Association, because the Aboriginal students of Waterloo recognize, perhaps more than almost anyone else at the University of Waterloo, that Indigenous rights matter everywhere. Voting yes in this referendum, and if this referendum passes, it'll tell the Indigenous people in Canada that we stand with Indigenous people everywhere, we stand with Indigenous people here, and it'll provide weight. It'll show that we're serious about reconciling and improving relations with Canada's Indigenous population. So now I'd just like to quickly bring up something that the No Committee said, and that is that universities do not determine Canada's foreign policy. I completely disagree, or at least I want to disagree. I want students to have a voice. I want students to be able to come together and say that what the Canadian government is doing and who the Canadian government is supporting, what we're doing is wrong. I want students to have a voice, and voting yes voting yes
30 seconds
will show that we do have a voice. Now, I don't think this referendum is about him versus her or them versus us. This is about human rights. Do we respect human rights? And it doesn't matter if you're Jewish or Muslim. In Hebrew school, I learned to love Israel, and indeed, I believe that the right of Jewish people to exist should exist, but that should not come at the expense of the Palestinians.
Thank you. Each committee will now be given 3 minutes to make a closing remark. Begin.
Well, we've heard a lot of debate today. I'd like to just clarify a few things. Justin Trudeau, my understanding is that the Yes Committee to label themselves as the BDS movement. Justin Trudeau was quoted tweeting that the BDS movement, like Israeli Apartheid Week, has no place on Canadian campuses. Furthering that, the Rona Ambrose and Tom Mulcair, the leader of the PCs or the Conservatives, and the NDP, respectively, have also stated that they're opposed to BDS. I think when you have the NDPs and the Conservatives agreeing on something, I think they have merit. Furthering that, I agree in the sense that students should have a voice in foreign policy. And you know what that agreement is? That agreement is going to protest and going to speak to your political offices. At the end of the day, politics have no right on universities' campuses, political ideals. This conversation shouldn't be here. This should be a place of academic thought and academic speech. But if you're trying to move a political decision, regardless of what it is, it should be done at your local consulate, it should be done at your local MP or MPP's office, and if it should be brought up in either types of parliament. It should not be brought up in the campuses. It should not be bringing into universities and people who want free ideas. The reason why the NDP, the Liberals, and the Conservatives oppose this is because they believe in the free flow of ideas. I believe in the free flow of ideas. I believe you guys believe in the free flow of ideas. And that is why I would like to keep politics outside of campuses. That's why I like to keep academics inside campuses. And that's why I believe you should vote no in this referendum. Thank you very much.
Please begin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, fellow No Committee. Now, we've been bombarded you with a lot of information. We've just talked about facts and different things that are going on, ideas. This whole debate has really been focused on who the potential beneficiaries are. So ask yourself, who benefits from the maintaining of the status quo? Look at world history itself. There have always been those working to maintain the status quo and those pushing for change. The world can only change if we choose to change it. We are students at one of the most prestigious institutions in the world, conducting cutting-edge technology. We have a reputation to maintain it. It's our work that is at stake. But first, we have to make a decision. What does this reputation include? What does it mean to be a UW student? Does it mean to innovate, to look past the status quo, to push for change, to push for a world where justice and human rights and equality for all of us is a goal of our institution? Or do we want to leave the political decision to the universities? It's above us. We got tuition to worry about. We truly believe that voting yes is inherently part of the definition of being a UW student. I urge you all to vote yes and respond to the call that millions of Palestinians and Israelis themselves have called for already. To end this racist system of occupation and segregation, we must stand together and support those who can't stand and are being silenced and suppressed. A vote no is not maintaining neutrality. A vote no is choosing to support ongoing abuses of human rights. My fellow students, my fellow peers, say yes to ethical collaboration. Say yes to academic freedom for all of us. Voting yes is a peaceful rejection of the violent powers that impose their agenda upon us. Voting yes is a rejection of the monetary and political powers that use our university as a benefactor and facilitator of racism. Voting yes is a statement that the only collaboration welcome here at the University of Waterloo are those that themselves welcome the rights of all people over the rights of few. We on the Yes Committee cannot wait for the day to reestablish these ties under good faith when our high standards of ethics as Canadians and specifically
30 seconds.
University of Waterloo students is met. I thank you for your time.
Could I have your attention? Just to be clear, there will not be a question and answer period, but of course the respective members of the committees are here. You're of course welcome to approach them. Please remember to vote, and www.feds.ca/elections is a great place to get information on important dates. Thank you for your attention.
Can we also get a round of applause for our moderator for doing a wonderful job?